One obviously was that they wanted to push Russia out of Europe once and for all. This was a historic opportunity with the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, and they wanted the removal of Russian influence. And what was in the way was the one country that was well disposed towards Russia, and the Serbs, historic friends, allies of the Russians, were seen to be in the way. So that was one issue. There was also a fear that Yugoslavia, because it kind of built its own distinctive form of socialism, it hadn't been part of the Warsaw Pact, it hadn't really formed the kind of Soviet-style socialism, that its own kind of market socialism, decentralization, worker management, all those things. They thought it might be an attractive model for socialism, a kind of social democracy, and they wanted to extirpate it right away. So I think those were the two important factors which were so determinative. But I think also there was the influence of Germany. I mean, Germany had just become reunited. That was in October the 3rd, 1990, and this was really Germany's first exercise in foreign policy, and it weighed in very heavily on its traditional allies, which was Croatia and to a lesser extent Slovenia. So I think that was really what was driving it. And I think obviously the breakup of Yugoslavia was taking place at the same time as the breakup of the USSR, and the Western powers wanted both really to be as weak and as fragmented as possible for as long as possible.
Anthony Lake in the States was talking about Yugoslavia being a cancer eating away at US foreign policy. Is it true to say that the events there did make the US look rather impotent, and NATO also, of course, was feeling rather obsolete?
Well, NATO was obviously feeling the pinch after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. So there was the fear that people are going to ask, well, if there's no Warsaw Pact, why do we need NATO? So therefore, they had to invent new roles for NATO. The United States is, I think, a little different. I mean, I think they were a little slow on the draw when it came to Yugoslavia. Germany ran the show in 1990 and 1991, and then the United States just caught up. They were a little bit taken aback by the speed with which Germany moved on Yugoslavia. And then they kind of decided that, if Germany had Croatia and Slovenia as its client states, the United States would have Bosnia-Herzegovina, but of course, only one particular national group in Bosnia-Herzegovina is the Muslims. So, that they decided, they threw in their lot, and Bosnia was to be, the place where they would make their stand in Yugoslavia.
It's quite clear from Madeleine Albright, known as the mother, of course, of the ICTY, that this was a huge opportunity for the Americans. And she actually wrote, the Balkans provided the context for a debate about the global role of the US, the relevance of NATO, the evolution of Russia, the limits of sovereignty, and the possibility of extending democracy to lands lacking a democratic tradition. That's what it was really about, wasn't it?
Well, that's the grand phraseology of the United States. I mean, I don't think democracy played very much of a role in it. I think that they saw that this would be a wonderful opportunity for the projection of American power, which is in fact what happened. I mean, after all of the states, with the exception of Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, for the same reason, because you still have that powerful Serbian minority, have been scooped up within NATO. And suddenly here was NATO has now grabbed for itself the Balkans. And remember, I mean, you had World War II, when you have the percentages agreement between Stalin and Churchill, Bulgaria, Romania, they were assigned to Stalin. They were now part of the Western Bloc. Hungary, 50-50. Hungary was now on the Western Bloc, and Yugoslavia was 50-50. So they were determined also to bring Yugoslavia. And suddenly the Balkans, the entirety of the Balkans was under the control of NATO.
Was there, do you think, any genuine humanitarian impulse behind the move to set up the ICTY?
It's very hard. I don't really see it. I think that they saw this as an opportunity to hold these war crimes trials. I mean, war crimes trials, play a big role in Western culture. You have the big Spencer Tracy movie. Everyone loved the whole drama. These horrible criminals. They're sitting there in the dark. Heads bowed. And all the condemnations raining down on them. And then, of course, you had the Eichmann trial with this, again, within that glass booth. So there was, it's part of the Western culture. And I think the Americans thought that if you bring up war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide, it's a wonderful public relations exercise for us. Shows how virtuous we are and how terrible they are. We don't do any of those kinds of things. They do. So I think that they saw this as a great, public relations exercise for the West, and they of course lied about it, because they said, "Oh, well, we're not going to make the mistakes that we made at Nuremberg, which was victor's justice." I said, "No, this isn't going to be victor's justice." But of course, I mean, whether it was victor's, but it was still very much one-sided justice.
So it was kind of base ambition under the guise of a noble cause, effectively.
Yeah, well, that's right, and that's of course what humanitarian intervention is really about. The most humanitarian, everyone gets on board. Hey, you're saving lives. Look, women and children, you got to come in and do something for them. That sounds good. And we have to do a little bit of bombing, but it's for a good cause. Okay, great. We'll have a bombing. That's a good cause. And then we'll hold these trials, and we'll shove people away for decades behind bars, and so. But it's all for a good cause. Yeah, okay, I'm down.
We've called Madeleine Albright the mother of ICTY and so on, but where do you think the seed was really planted historically? We've seen stuff from the CIA where they rather liked the idea of it. They could see how it could be used. What do you think the origin really was?
Well, I think that if you remember the war crimes trial, which were again quite popular, people, as I mentioned, the Spencer Tracy movie, they were wrapped up. They were wrapped up pretty early on, by the late 1940s, early 50s, because they wanted to get Germany on board for the Cold War. So they didn't want to go on having all these trials and bringing, wave after wave of Germans for answer for war crimes. So they were kind of wrapped up, and they didn't want to cooperate in any case with the Soviet Union. So they said, okay, well, we're not going to get any evidence from the Soviet Union because we don't believe anything the Soviet Union tells us. So that evidence, the evidence that they were offering, we're not going to accept. But of course, if you don't have the evidence from the Soviet Union, then you don't really have much evidence to hold these trials. So they wrapped that up. But it started, the kind of the war crimes juggernaut really began in Gulf War I, because there was talk at the time of putting Saddam Hussein on trial, and then for what the Iraqis had done in Kuwait. But that was kind of shot down because the Bush administration, they just wanted to wrap it up. It didn't want to this whole thing to go on for too long. So that preceded the Yugoslavia thing. So as soon as that the Gulf War I was over, Yugoslavia started, and then everyone was on board. So you're right. I mean, Madeleine Albright was just one of the people who was involved in that, because there were also the French. The French were also very keen on pushing forward with setting up a tribunal. I don't think so, because he could only really claim legitimacy if the people involved had accepted the jurisdiction of the tribunal, because ultimately, as far as the UN Charter is concerned, the states are sovereign. Now, they can cede their sovereignty if they say, okay, we accept the establishment of an international criminal tribunal to put us on trial, then okay, that's fine. They've ceded their sovereignty, but none of that happened. And there's really nothing in the charter that says, well, you can set up an international criminal court to put on trial those who don't accept the jurisdiction of such an international criminal court. But that's what the UN Security Council did, under Chapter 7. They said, okay, well, because of these, there's an emergency, international security emergency, we have to set up this tribunal. But there's nothing in the charter to justify that.
But essentially, they had to internationalize the conflict to give themselves a reason for going in.
Right, that's right. So they had to say that this poses an enormous security threat to the world community. But again, on what basis? I mean, this was a war, very unpleasant, obviously, but nonetheless, it was fairly limited in terms of place and time. So hard to see how it posed any kind of a threat to the international community. But the problem is that under the Charter, the UN Security Council can pretty much just define, for themselves exactly, what poses a threat to the international community. The problem for the Serbs was that Russia, which normally would have been very skeptical about any such move by the UN Security Council and would have, normally would have vetoed such a move, they just went AWOL and simply signed on to this establishment of the tribunal.
The 1948 Genocide Convention explicitly states, doesn't it, that national courts are the appropriate venue to try individuals. How exactly was that got round?
Well, the way they got around that is said that we don't trust the national courts of the former Yugoslavia. We don't trust them to be fair in the way that they would conduct their trials. But of course, it was all quite ridiculous, because after all, after World War II, they did trust the German courts to hold trials for German war criminals, and no one raised a problem. Hey, they're putting on trial themselves, and of course the Germans did hand out very lenient sentences by and large, not to everyone, but by and large very lenient sentences. But so that was okay. But suddenly we're asked to believe that, well, we trusted Germany, but we can't possibly trust you.
Nuremberg was innovatory in its prosecution and conviction of individuals for the supreme crime of planning and executing a war of aggression. This didn't appear, did it, in the statutes of the ICTY?
No, it didn't, for a very good reason, because the United States has never accepted that as a war crime. Still doesn't. I mean, it's not part of the charter of the International Criminal Court either. So although there is a UN General Assembly resolution defining the crime of aggressive war, that never made it to the into the statute of the ICTY. So they only had genocide, crimes against humanity, and violations of the laws of war. But they were very careful, because the Americans were never going to accept aggressive war as a war crime.
Just taking a step back to look at how the Americans went about establishing control of the tribunal, DePaul University in the States played a big part in this, and a guy called Michael Scharf of the State Department. Can you tell me a little bit about how the whole thing was rigged?
Well, that's right, because the first person who was appointed to essentially investigate the whether the crimes have been committed, whether there's a reliable database for the crimes, or this guy, an Austrian, Fritz Karlshoven. And Karlshoven was a little skeptical. In the first place, he wasn't really convinced that there was evidence pointing to the criminality of the leaders. Because it's very important to remember that the issue here was they wanted to get the leaders. And that was, Albright said this when they set up the ICTY, and the French jury said, oh, we got to go after the leaders, the people who order these crimes on a systematic basis. You know, that's what, this is the raison d'etre. You know, they want to just commit crimes. And he said, well, I haven't seen any evidence pointing to the leaders ordering the commission of any crimes. And then he even said, I'm not even convinced by the evidence that I've heard. You know, people often just repeat what others have told them. People's memories are a little hazy. Whereas the guy, this DePaul University, there was this guy, this Bassioni. He was the one that the Americans wanted. Now, they wanted Bassioni to be investigating this database of crimes. But I think Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the UN Secretary General at the time, he kind of saw what the Americans were up to, and then he didn't really want to play along with the Americans, so he didn't pick Bassioni, which you might have expected he would, because Bassioni was an Egyptian and Boutros-Ghali was obviously an Egyptian. But he picked Karlshoven, but Karlshoven then came under a lot of attack from the Americans. They didn't like his skepticism. So it was inevitable that Karlshoven was shoved out of the way, and then in came Bassioni, and then he kind of basically just created this database, which was largely fictional. I mean, he came up with such ridiculous numbers for the rapes, for murders, and so on. I mean, they were just ludicrously exaggerated. But that's exactly what the Americans wanted. They wanted numbers to be inflated as much as possible.
Now, it was Bassioni, wasn't it, largely, who had this sort of concept of new laws and criminal enterprise and all this sort of stuff, and took every opportunity to sort of make prosecution easy and defense almost impossible. Yes.
That was it. That was his goal. And then he wanted to, involve things like, rape. You'd make rape into a war crime, even though that had already been a subsumed under crimes against humanity. So yeah, he wanted to expand this, and of course the point about the joint criminal enterprise, that it's a concept which is that it was actually a confession on the part of the ICTY that project, that they were going to get the big fish, the leaders, had failed. I mean, they didn't have the evidence that the big fish, the leaders, had ordered the commission of crimes. In fact, all the evidence pointed the other way. You could come up and say, here are these orders from Radovan Karadzic specifically prohibiting the commission of crimes. Here are his orders promising punishment for anyone who commits crimes. So they realized that the evidence had pointed the other way. So then they said, oh, well, we'll have this joint criminal enterprise in which you supposedly share a state of mind. And of course, if you share a state of mind, which the ICTY just defines it, then you're guilty of everything that everybody else also shares that state of mind, who are also part of the joint criminal enterprise.
Hence, JC stands for Just Convict Everyone.
That's right. That was that was actually formulated, oddly enough, by Professor William Shabas, who was actually an advocate for the ICTY. He's a big fan of the ICTY, but nonetheless, he did coin that phrase, "Just convict everybody."
One of the extraordinary things about this court was that it actually started work, didn't it, while conflict was ongoing? How unusual was that?
Extremely unusual, and it didn't really make very much sense. But again, the Western powers, they were very keen on elevating themselves, but also continuing the war for as long as possible, because you would have thought, well, let's get this war over and done with, and then we can start talking about a trial. But no, they want the trial. But of course, that, and everybody said, even skeptics said at the time, well, that's going to prolong things, because people think that they're going to go be put on trial and sentenced to life imprisonment. Then they have no interest in bringing a war to an end, because they're afraid of what's going to happen to them at the end of the war. So it was a strange sort of thing of essentially, how do we keep the war going for as long as possible. The same thing happened, incidentally, with the establishment of the safe areas in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I mean, again, they weren't safe by any stretch of the imagination, but they prevented a swift resolution of the war.
How big a part did that play in the workings of ICTY?
Well, of course, it played a very big part, because command responsibility is a very it's a very nebulous term, because obviously if you're a commander and you order your subordinate to commit a crime, yeah, you're obviously culpable for the crime of the subordinate, but that's not quite what people mean by command responsibility. So command responsibility means you knew ahead of time a crime would be committed, and you didn't do everything in your power to stop it, or you didn't, once the crime was committed, you didn't punish it properly. Then it starts getting to be very dubious. I mean, really, you knew ahead of time that would be committed, and then of course you have the real problem is that, well, what does any of that have to do with the leaders? Because after all, they're after the leaders, because they're not sitting there, dealing with individual crimes. So, how can you go after command responsibility for Milosevic, who had no command of any of the armies in Croatia or in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but they still have to get him on command responsibility. That's why they had to invent that whole joint criminal enterprise issue, because even when you have an elastic notion like command responsibility, you still are not going to get the leaders.
And of course, in the case of Mladic, I mean, I've just been looking at Judge Nyambe's dissenting opinion on his appeal, and he went down for things that he had actively opposed.
Yes, yeah. That's right. That's right. Well, that's part of the joint criminal enterprise notion, that even though you didn't commit the crime, you didn't want anyone to commit the crime, you didn't know about this crime, and you had actually opposed and done your best to stop the crime. Even so, if you're part of the joint criminal enterprise, you are nonetheless guilty. And of course, the point is they really don't have any of that kind of the chain of command in terms of even the crimes. I mean, their big jewel in the crown is Srebrenica. But I think, as Judge Nyambe said, we still don't know who ordered this crime. I mean, because that's why, again, this is the jewel of everything. I see Srebrenica, but you don't know who ordered this crime. Karadzic didn't order it. Mladic didn't order it. And they still can't find it. And the only people we know were involved, at least as far as the ICTY told us, is essentially a mercenary unit. So who ordered this crime? But they don't really care. They just say, something somehow, and the public believes, well, Karadzic and Mladic obviously ordered the Srebrenica.
One of the other extraordinary facts was that the indictments were amended during trials, and the rules generally just kept changing, didn't they? It was in constant flux.
Yes. For instance, in the Milosevic trial, his indictment was amended after the prosecution had already presented its case. So if the indictment continues to get amended, it's hard to see how can you present a defense when the prosecutors keep changing their case against you. And you're right. I mean, the point about these rule changes is that all of the rule changes were directed toward making prosecution as easy as possible. They were all, for instance, they had to protect witnesses because, one of these witnesses were often very implausible. They were either kind of a political apparatchiki, whether Western political apparatchiki or local political apparatchiki. Therefore, they had an agenda, obvious agenda. So they would be very much liable to be seriously challenged by the defense. So they had to manipulate things in such a way that defendants couldn't really challenge them in any proper way. And of course, you had all sorts of defendants who just were relying on hearsay, things that they hadn't actually seen themselves, wild exaggerations, I don't know how many witnesses come forward and say, oh yeah, everybody was executed except for me. I hid under the bodies, so they left, there were all these bodies on top of me, but I crawled out and I managed to make it to safety.
But a huge amount of testimony was heard in secret, wasn't it? Yes. Witnesses were generally protected from cross-examination, and of course, the DNA evidence is locked up forever. Yes. Laws have been passed to give the IMCP complete immunity.
That's right. The DNA evidence, and I mean, witnesses they testify in secret. Then they have their voice distorted, their image distorted. This again makes defense very difficult because you have then very limited amount of knowledge about who this defendant is. And so while the defendant himself may know who this defendant is, he's not really allowed to share this information with his associates, with the people who may be helping him with this case. So it hampers the work of the defense, but it also hampers the work of the public. I mean, the point about trials is that these are supposed to be public trials. I mean, so the trial, the public has to be able to judge, is this a credible defendant? But if you keep putting them in secret, or you have entire blocks, oh, this person testified, we had him for about 10 minutes in which he introduced himself, and then everything else was done in secret. So how is the public supposed to judge, is this a credible witness or not?
And of course, defendants, even if they were acquitted, were instantly vulnerable to double jeopardy, weren't they?
Double jeopardy, exactly. It's an amazing innovation whereby prosecutors can challenge an acquittal, which is just really bizarre. So if the miracle happens and you are acquitted, it doesn't mean you're released. The prosecutor then appeals, and of course you also have prosecutors appealing the leniency of sentences. So someone is, I think Radovan Karadzic, he's sentenced to 40 years in prison. The prosecution appeals. No, that's too lenient. This is a man who's, I don't know how old he was. It was in his 60s at least. 40 years, that's basically life. No, it has to be life. And of course, the appellate court upholds it, and Radovan Karadzic is sentenced to life.
And of course, these sentences that were handed out were far in excess of what a sovereign nation would have given to its citizens.
Well, that's right. And there again, they got around their own rules, because the rule was supposed to be that the sentences had to be proportionate to what the sentences were at the time the crimes were committed. That's what the sentences would have been in the former Yugoslavia. But the way it worked in the former Yugoslavia is that you either were sentenced to death, or if you weren't sentenced to death, and then I think the maximum was 20 years. They don't have the sort of the American way of you just spend the rest of your life in prison with no hope of parole. I mean, I think they regarded that as sadistic. So that should have been the operating principle for the tribunal, because obviously in Europe, the death penalty has been abolished. But the Americans then got around it and said, no, no, we can't have this. This is much too lenient. Again, this Michael Scharf in particular, he really campaigned. No, 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 we can't allow people to be released after 20 years, even though 20 years is. Albert Speer was sentenced to 20 years, so you know that's no picnic. But they got around it, and I think even Bassioni thought, hey, you're kind of making ex post facto law here. I mean, if you know that you're changing the sentence, you know, ex post facto, but nonetheless, as always, the Americans got their way.
But, and even pre-trial detention was indefinite, wasn't it?
Indefinite, exactly, because you were there, and then they can just hold you there forever while they prepare their case. I think Šešelj, I think he had waited 8 years before he was put on trial, which is again absolutely absurd, because if you haven't been convicted of anything, then you can't just be detained there ad infinitum, and that's it. And it's not just Šešelj. I mean, he's just the most well-known case. I think when they after the strange death of Milosevic, the ICTY brought in these Swedish penologists to do a kind of an inspection of the ICTY, and of course the Swedes were very pro ICTY, but even they said, hey, there's an awful lot of people here who have been detained for years and years without their cases coming to trial. So even they were a little troubled by that.
Was the investigation into the death of Milosevic by ICTY ever made public?
They published the report, but the report was, of course, ridiculously inadequate. Because they blamed him for his own death. They claimed that he was self-medicating, but they didn't have any evidence that he was self-medicating. So because they had a real problem on their hands. I mean, because Milosevic had been inspected by some doctors, international doctors, and they said he's very sick. And then the Russian cardiac center said, well, he can come here, we will treat him, and then we will return him to the ICTY. And the ICTY rejected this proposal. And then 2 weeks later, Milosevic dies of a heart attack. So it had a problem on its hands. So it had to absolve itself of blame as to why he hadn't been getting proper treatment during the time he had been at the prison. And they said, oh, well, he had been getting first-rate treatment. It's just that he was self-medicating. But then when you read the report, you ask, well, where's your evidence that he's self-medicating? And so, oh, well, he was, his associates and his attorneys, they were smuggling in drugs. Well, did you actually ever catch anyone smuggling drugs? No. So it was a whitewash by the ICTY of itself. But the problem is that the ICTY isn't answerable to anyone. I mean, it's not even answerable to the UN Security Council. I mean, the UN Security Council should have ordered some kind of a proper investigation. But basically, the ICTY is just a law unto itself. It doesn't have to pay any attention to the UN Security Council. Right. That's exactly right. Because, of course, when they said individuals, who do they mean by individuals? Well, Milosevic, Karadzic, Mladic, that 7 Serb presidents, 7, the presidents, Serb presidents in Croatia, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Serbia proper, 7 have been were put on trial at the ICTY. I think Milosevic died, but Milutinovic was the Serbian president. I think he was acquitted, but the rest were convicted and given, obviously hefty prison terms. So if you say these are the individuals that you're going after, well, you're going after the nation. I mean, because it was they were the leaders of the Serbian people, and of course it was a matter of punishing the Serbian people. And Eagleberger, who was one of the first really to say that the real war criminals are Milosevic, Mladic, and Karadzic, and he said this in December 1992. He said, that the opprobrium of history will attach to the Serbian people because of the people for whom these were the people who had led the Serbian people. So he said that clearly by focusing on Milosevic, Mladic, and Karadzic, you were basically focusing on the crimes of the Serbian people, that they are committing crimes on behalf of the Serbian people. So it was always nonsense that they were going after individuals. That's why they right away, they focused on the leaders. But as I said, they didn't really have the evidence of the leaders, so they had to get around it and create all these kind of fictional concepts like joint criminal enterprise.
Essentially, what the ICTY was trying to do was to enshrine a false narrative of history, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And the false narrative was that the Western powers had acted nobly, selflessly, blamelessly when it came to the breakup of Yugoslavia, and all the various kind of decisions it had made, such as, hey, Yugoslavia is no more, it's a state in dissolution, the administrative boundaries will become international frontiers, and the core Yugoslavia does not exist, so therefore Yugoslavia would have to reapply to join the United Nations. The Serbian minorities would just have to accept their status as minorities in somebody else's state. All of these decisions, they said, oh, these were all perfectly fine and appropriate. And the horrible, beastly people were the Serbs, who basically thought that this was a completely unfair way to destroy a country, given that these were illegal secessions by any understanding of what secession means. Remember, the Yugoslav Constitutional Court, which was accepted throughout the world, had ruled the secessions to be illegal. I mean, they just said it was illegal, and then the Europeans came in and said, "Well, we don't care about that. We think that they're legal, and the hell with that." So that was the basic crime that was destroyed Yugoslavia, but obviously the ICTY had to show no, that was all perfectly fine. It was the Serbs who rejected the diktats of the Western powers. They were the criminals.
So essentially, the one body of people that wanted to hold Yugoslavia together is taking the blame for it breaking up.
Exactly, and that's why they had to. That was part of the narrative that they constructed. Oh, the Serbs were seeking to create Greater Serbia. That's why Yugoslavia broke up. So it wasn't really secession; it was Serb aggression that triggered the secession, of the departure of the other nations, because they were terrified of Greater Serbia. But of course, they've never been able to come up with any evidence of any Greater Serbia plan. There was none. There was no such plan. And when Croatia and Slovenia pushed for independence in June of 1991, where was the Greater Serbia? That wasn't the Greater Serbia. They just said, we're not going to bother with negotiating anything. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to have a referendum, and we're out of here. But the Western powers, which immediately recognized these secessions, they didn't even attempt to try to bring some sort of peace, some sort of reconciliation, hold off on the breakup. They said right away, okay, we're just going to recognize it. Total violation of international norms. And once they've done that, they can't very well accept blame for it. They have to say, oh, it was the Serbs. It was all the terrible Serbs.
But because it was their rush to recognize the secessionists, that they really bear the moral responsibility. That's what you would argue, isn't it?
I would definitely argue that, because that by doing what they did, by essentially accepting something that was clearly illegal. I mean, if we just look at what happened in Croatia, the nationalists, extreme nationalists, supported by Germany, come to power. First thing they do is they strip the Serbs of their status as the constituent nation of Croatia. Well, there was a reason why they did that, because they couldn't push for independence without the consent of a constituent nation. Because that's the whole point of being a constituent nation, which is no big constitutional changes can be undertaken without the consent of all of the constituent nations. So what they do, they strip them of their status, and then they had a referendum, which the Serbs obviously boycotted, and then they declared, okay, fine, we're leaving. So this was a fundamental illegality that obviously the Yugoslav Constitutional Court said, oh, this is illegal, but the Western nations rushed in, and they knew that this was cause a great deal of pain for the Serbs, because they still remember the horrors of World War II. So remember, 1991 is only 45 years since the end of World War II. Therefore, what happened in Croatia, which was a Nazi collaborationist state, what happened was within the living memory of many, many people at the time. And as well, obviously, you have the families and the sons and daughters and so on. They all knew about this. So the idea of that, oh, well, we'll just go on our way, particularly with somebody like Tudjman at the helm, who was, to say the least, a kind of a revisionist when it came to the Ustasha Nazi collaborationist regime. Well, you were bound to trigger a violent response. And it did trigger a violent response. And, and then, of course, you had a few months later, Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was, again, they knew perfectly well. They went ahead and they knew perfectly well that this would trigger a violent response. And that's why, you had the UN Secretary General at the time was Perez de Cuellar, who pleaded with the Western powers, don't do this, don't recognize the secession, because there's bound to be violence. And they went ahead and did it anyway. Well, I think that's the idea, that Putin would face something of that nature, because I think that that body of jurisprudence, mediocre though it undoubtedly is, will be used at the International Criminal Court if they manage to get their hands on the people that they want to get their hands on. The problem for the ICC has been that obviously they can't go after NATO. They don't want to go after NATO. They can't go after the United States, but they haven't been able to go after Russia either, because, well, Russia's a big power, and Russia also doesn't accept the jurisdiction of the ICC. China also doesn't accept the jurisdiction of the ICC. So they've only been able to go after Africans because, well, it's safe to go after them. But yeah, I do think that they want to use this as a kind of body of law. And that say, hey, yeah, look, we got this joint criminal enterprise and command responsibility, but a lot of it's just out of geopolitics. Are they ever going to be able to get their hands on Putin and individual Russians?
So you really think that a court that you have characterized as a star chamber will endure?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, I think that that humanitarian intervention enterprise, I think the idea of using criminal law to go after your geopolitical adversaries. The whole war crimes racket that the Human Rights Brigade and the whole international humanitarian law crowd, they're not going to let it go. I mean, it's just too much fun. There's too much money in it, so that they're going to do it. And again, the United States wants to present itself as on the side of the angels. And so therefore it's going to go on funding this kind of thing. So yeah, we do all these things just so that we can have proper criminal justice.
I know you've been spending a lot of time on Ukraine recently. Do you see parallels between what happened in Kosovo and what's been happening in Ukraine?
Yeah, I do think that. I think that what happened in Ukraine was, again, it was the USSR broke up, and the West saw that Ukraine and the individual republics would be very useful allies, client states, and so on. But the problem was that these borders that had been drawn up were drawn up by the communists. So we had the kind of irony of the supposedly anti-communist West simply saying, oh yeah, we accept that these have to be the international frontiers, even though they'd been drawn up by Stalin, and Stalin did this because he wanted to set nations against each other. So Ukraine was an artificial creation by the Soviets. I mean, it was initially Lenin who took, again, part of Russia into Ukraine, and then we had the various additions that Stalin had made, the bits of Poland, the bits of Hungary, Romania, then Khrushchev added Crimea into the mix. But the West said, oh yeah, we accept all of that. Much as they did this in Yugoslavia, which also said, hey, we accept everything that the communists did, because the communists, unlike the West, wanted to downgrade the Serbs. The Serbs were the most populous nation in Yugoslavia. They created the original Yugoslavia. So the communists did whatever they could in order to minimize the influence of the Serbs, which is why they kind of created these fictional nations like the Muslims, or Montenegro. So that the Montenegrins became a nation. So suddenly Serbs were just one of 6 nations. But the communists had the same idea about Russia, because Russia was obviously the biggest nation within the USSR. So they did everything they could in order to minimize the influence of Russia. Again, it wasn't just Ukraine that they took a chunk of Russia and added it on. I mean, they were kind of constantly creating little nations and little entities within Russia. Every time they found someone who spoke a dialect of Russia, a nation, they need their own territory. So they created all these autonomous republics and autonomous oblasts and everything. And so, I think that became a part of that. And Ukraine was seized upon by the West very early on. This was long before the Orange Revolution of 2004, the 2014 coup. Right in the 1990s, the West had already moved in on Ukraine. They saw its geopolitical usefulness, and they helped foster a kind of Ukrainian nationalism, a kind of a very anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalism.
Do you think that Western insensitivity to the expansion of NATO and its impact on Russia has been a big contributory factor to the mess we're in now?
Absolutely. I think absolutely. I mean, I think the Russians warned again and again and again, and this even started under Yeltsin, that we're very unhappy about this expansion of NATO. It's a threat to our security, and we can't put up with this, forever. And then when you think about what happened, because I think that the Biden administration, we have a whole history of these post-Maidan people, in 2014, their association with the Democrats, particularly Biden, Jake Sullivan and Victoria Nuland, once they came to power, they had every intention of basically steamrolling Ukraine into NATO. Of course, they said, oh, no, there are no immediate plans. It's clear there were immediate plans. It's clear from, when Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, he went to Ukraine and he said, that was in October of last year, the road to NATO membership is open. Said this to George as well. Then we had in November the signing of that strategic partnership agreement between United States and Ukraine. I think the Russians felt that they're going to push for Ukraine membership, maybe sometime around June of this year. Before that, probably in March, they would try to do a kind of a lightning strike in the Donbass, along the lines of what Tudjman did in Operation Storm in 1995, and then present the world with a fait accompli, and then that's it. And then the road to NATO membership would be open, because I say, well, there's no longer a conflict on Ukraine territory, so Ukraine can join. I think the Russians really felt very threatened, because if they allowed that to happen, then they would be in a very, very tight spot, because then to do what they did now, they would be taking on NATO, and that would be a very, very dangerous enterprise. So I think that's why they felt they had to move now before this became a fait accompli that Ukraine was in NATO.